Hello everyone from the whole of East Africa. Welcome to this webinar organized by the East African Law Society. Your moderator today is Frank Awagakwaye. I'm the Strategy and Research Manager at the Development Bank of Rwanda. I'm pleased to welcome you all, our dear panelists, as well as the audience that is following us online. This webinar is organized as part of the ELS capacity building sessions for its members, particularly the in-house council. And I'm pleased to moderate this insightful session that is going to last between 1.5 hours to 2 hours. And we'll be bringing together, as you can see, a richly diverse panel. We will be discussing and dissecting a very good topic that we probably have had of most recent. That's about environmental, social, and governance practice in East Africa. So this panel will help us to discuss the trends in ESG in light of the uncertain global markets and its effects on the board, management, and of course, the in-house council of these organizations in East Africa. So quickly, I would like to introduce our panel. I would start with Catherine Musakari. She's the founder of Dorian Associates, LLP. You're welcome, Madam Catherine. Maybe you can unmute and greet the audience.
Thank you very much, Frank. Good afternoon, colleagues across the region. Very happy to be here with you this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you're joining from.
Thank you so much. Next, among our distinguished panel, we have Beatrice Nyambira, who's the partner and head of projects at ICAM Advocates. Hi, Beatrice, can you unmute and say hi to the audience? Thank you.
Good afternoon. And thank you so much, Frank, for setting this up and for moderating this panel. I'm looking forward to an engaging discussion because this topic is really relevant and close to many people's heart.
Thank you so much. Hi, Sonal Tejpal. She's the partner head of banking, finance, and service at ALN Kenya. Hi, Sonal. Can you say hi? Greet the audience. Thank you.
Hello, Frank. Hello, everyone. Very pleased to be here and really looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And lastly, I would like to introduce Lilian Gichuru. She's a legal and external affairs manager at Nairobi Securities Exchange. Hi, Lilian.
Hello, Frank, and good afternoon to everyone. It's my singular honor and privilege to, join in this conversation as well. So looking forward to this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So as we welcome some of our audience online and following this webinar through Zoom, I'd like to start by just asking our panel, with the latest trends about ESG, we have heard a lot about environmental, social, and social governance as well, which is commonly known under its acronym ESG. I just wanted to know, how did you get into this space? To become, of course, experts as you are. And before we jump into the serious matter of this topic, I just wanted to hear from all of you. And I will start with, once again, in the same order, Catherine. Briefly tell us how you got into this field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's a very interesting area, and I got into this field way back in around 2014, when I led the development of 3 codes of corporate governance in Kenya. That is the Code of Corporate Governance for listed entities, Mwongozo Code for state corporations, and Institute of Certified Secretaries for Code for private entities. And at that time, as I was leading that process, we were looking at trends across the world, looking into the future and asking ourselves the question, what should we be asking our entities, corporate entities to get into? And so for those who are in Kenya and are familiar with those codes, you will find that each of those codes contains provisions around ESG. In addition to that, I have spent a lot of my life just advising boards on their processes, procedures, and what they need to do in order to, lead sustainable organizations. And because of that, I have gotten a very deep interest into matters of ESG, because really the whole of corporate governance, which is my area of interest, is an issue of ESG. So that is why, Frank, I have been very, very interested in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Beatrice. Tell us briefly about your journey and, of course, expertise in this space of ESG related work you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. So for me, I got into ESG as part of my day-to-day legal practice. So I had the projects and infrastructure practice at DLA Piper Africa in Kenya. And so just the nature of projects is such that they have so many stakeholders and they're so cross-cutting. There's so many issues that come up when you're putting up, say, a renewable energy project. You're looking at water systems and those kind of things. So you have to look at, say, environment. So what is the impact of whatever projects you're putting up on the environment? How will the environment be restored? You look at issues such as land, are you going to have to resettle people? There's a time we had issues to do with anthills and, tires and all that. So these are issues that really affect communities and people. Governance of whatever entity you're setting up. So, is the board representative? Is it inclusive? So all those issues arise on a day-to-day basis when you're doing project development. Over and above that, a number of our clients, have, with time, they're gaining more interest in ESG. For example, listed entities now, I think the Nairobi Securities Exchange gave some guidance as to, the kind of reporting they need to do. So you get a lot of approaches from such entities looking to see how, they can meet requirements, how they can put systems in place. Clients who are looking to make investments now are looking at, what's the ESG implication before they put in their money, and trying to help smaller companies, be more, I don't want to say compliant, but let me use it for now. So I think that's really how my interest in this topic developed.
Thank you. Lastly, Lillian, tell us about your journey with the ESG and how you built your expertise over the past few years. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think Sonal has gone. I heard you say lastly, but I think I'll go then. Sonal can, pick it up from me. For me, truthfully speaking, I stumbled onto ESG on my day-to-day legal practice as well. It is really by default. I will be lying if I said I went out of my way to, just find out what this ESG, buzzword was about, but it did find me here at the exchange. And by the fact that the NSC became a thought leader in sustainability reporting, which is a practice of, an organization's practice of reporting publicly its economic, environmental, social impacts. And this was through, of course, development and issuance of the NSC disclosures and guidance manual, which is basically a guide for companies, particularly, we don't say just listed entities, but we are trying to encourage all companies, to just use this manual. So it's a guide on how to, how companies can collect, analyze, and publicly disclose important ESG information to their respective shareholders in an approach or in a way that meets international standards. So for me, Frank, thanks to the NSC, I think I'll credit this to my employer. That is how I got into this ESG space. And it's a really interesting and evolving topic that I've just gotten immersed into over time. So thank you.
Thank you, and sorry for skipping you, Sonal, but over to you.
No problem, Frank. I won't take it personally. So my journey started, I guess, without knowing that ESG was a thing, and it really wasn't a word or an expression we used until quite recently. So I head the firm's banking, finance, and insolvency teams. DFIs like the IFC have been pushing the agenda on ESG principles for their borrowers for many years now. And over the years, whether it's our projects and infrastructure team, or our energy team, or our corporate team, those who deal with private equity investments, all of these different facets of our firm are involved in some shape or form with ESG. So we established a group, a few years ago, but I think all lawyers have been dealing with the ESG without knowing. We offer corporate governance training, and that was really, I think, the genesis of advising boards on their fiduciary and legal duties. The S we were doing in terms of projects work or oil and gas and mining work, where it's important for companies to ensure that they develop and maintain good relationships with the communities in which their projects are based. And I think even from a CSR perspective, and I'm sure every company on the call will have a CSR agenda, even that is part of the S in ESG. And for ourselves, our CSR has involved working with people like, let me see, the Flip Floppy Project, which is a circular economy movement, a dhow that is made out of rubber flip-flops, waste on beaches in Kenya, which has really now moved to something much bigger than that, where we're actually helping them devise legislation to have an East Africa without single-use plastics. So we're involved in drafting some legislative framework for them. So I think it's someone used, I think Lillian or Beatrice used the word stumble. I think many of us are stumbling into this without knowing, but I think we're all doing some sort of ESG in our practices. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. Well, for the benefit of the audience that is following us, I think each one of you has touched on how ESG, your journey walking to the ESG space. I just wanted to ask Lillian, maybe just for emphasis, how has the ESG practice evolved over the last few years, especially in the context of course, corporate entities in East Africa? I just wanted you to give us a little background on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. So what we have observed is that, or what can be observed is that, global trends in assessment of corporate performance, indicate a shift from focus, from a focus of one dimension. Just, in the past, it's just been, what is the financial performance of a company? What is the bottom line? How are we doing in our financial ratios? What's our ROI? How are we doing on the cost, cost versus the income ratio? How are we doing on that? So the trend these days has been that, investors, stakeholders are shifting their focus from just a financial performance of a company, and they want to see the non-performance aspect of things. How are you as a company impacting the environment in which you're operating? How are you impacting the people around you? So that is the whole genesis of how this whole ESG issue has evolved over time. So the modern investor, and if I could speak particularly in the capital market space, which is where I'm at, and I believe it's also, in the other sectors across, across the world, is that they're increasingly looking at for more comprehensive information about companies. Yeah, and the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, what was the impact of that? And not just to people individually, but as companies. That is part of ESG. Global environment and social crises that we are observing around the world, transition into renewable energy and renewed focus on human rights. All these things have intensified the need and the drive for ESG integration by corporates. Secondly, Frank, it is also an issue of transparency. And you will agree with me that transparency impacts on a business, and it's essentially important to continually communicate and improve on how we report to our stakeholders, and not just investors, to all our different stakeholders. Obviously, without transparency, the trust, diminishes, and without trust, markets don't function properly. This is why the practice of, sustainability reporting has steadily, grown, particularly over the past 2 decades. So, transparency has also driven, this whole ESG agenda. Number 3 is an issue of, best believe it, especially for corporates, it's also a branding and visibility tool. Look at it this way. Let me use a corporate like Safaricom that we are all aware of. We know the sort of things that Safaricom does with, say, for instance, the Safaricom Foundation. A friend of mine told me that they went to a remote part of Ukambani here in Kenya, and they found a ward, a maternity ward that had been done by the M-Pesa Foundation. That is a way of impacting that particular community in which Safaricom is operating. And for someone like that, it's just not a maternity ward. The brand itself. This is Safaricom. So that's, in as much as it's, a social impact on the society, it's also a way of Safaricom reminding us, hey, we are here. All right. The other point for me could be, we have noted trends, or it could be noted that customers are more and more supporting sustainable businesses. And like Catherine had said earlier at the beginning of this, it's just not about finances or what's my return on investment. People are looking at, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing beyond, of course, profits are good. We all invest to get a return, but what are you doing over and above that? There's a company in Kenya that I'm not going to mention that was heavily fined or had to do a payout in the millions, of hundreds of millions, for alleged human rights violations. So these are the sort of things, and of course you can see the sort of impact that could be, or that could have on a company. So these are the sort of things that, we need to be aware of, and the sort of things that are driving this sustainability agenda. Last but not least, ESG is helping, or facilitating decision-making and capital allocation. Case in point, I will try and use as many companies here in Kenya where we operate really. For instance, Bamburi Cement the other day adopted solar power. This has to be a decision that was made in a boardroom to move from, the normal power into solar power. So you can see how the ESG conversation is finding itself in boardrooms, so that by the time a board of directors is sitting and deciding, no, we need to be more aware of or use more renewable energy, and thus adopting solar power. This is, we can tell the impact of ESG in our companies. I hope I'm not taking too much time, Frank.
No, you're almost done, but you can, yes, conclude. Thank you.
I'm done, yeah.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Well, thank you for giving us kind of the ESG journey and context over the last few years. Maybe you talked of it being where organizations go beyond reporting financial performance. So I'm just curious, and I guess the audience is also wondering, for someone in finance and banking, and that brings me to Sonal, what else should an entity maybe in banking or related activities, what else should they report about so they can comply maybe with ESG?
Thanks, Frank. So I think I just wanted to pick up on some of the points that were made earlier, because I think before going to answer the question, what should bank and financial institutions be thinking about, I think what are the factors around the ESG growth story in this part of the world, I think is important. And I know Lillian touched on a few of these, but just if when I woke up this morning and turned on the news, we're already aware of the impact of climate change, right? So today's headline was there's a significant temperature hike in the south of Spain, which is very unusual. Temperatures reaching 40 degrees, and there are tourists there who would normally enjoy cooler temperatures and who are now rethinking their holiday plans in the future because of climate change. The Panama Canal, also in the news today, is the Panama Canal, which I think has 6% of the world's maritime shipping, is now on reduced operations because of a drought and declining waters. So the issue of ESG and sustainability and all these factors, I think, are in our world every day, whether we're conscious of it or not. And I think every business, not just financial institutions, but every business really does need to think about it. And these risk factors are not just for the companies in our region, like banks and like listed companies where there are now mandatory disclosure requirements. I think it's incumbent on every board member, investor, and business to think about how these factors impact their business. So, for example, in Uganda last year, I know there's an American tower company who, without having to actually comply with any law in Uganda, I believe made an announcement that it was voluntarily going to incorporate pro-environment and climate solutions into their business plan. And they were talking about implementing a shift to green energy sources such as solar and lithium batteries. In Kenya, before the likes of East African Breweries or EABL had to be complying with the regulations that Lillian was talking about, they have been reporting on ESG for many years voluntarily. As was Safaricom, who was also mentioned earlier. And so I think these are things that all businesses really do need to consider if they are not considering already. Lillian quite rightly mentioned that there are serious reputational issues for those who do not, and I think the headlines are always going to be about those who are getting things wrong, not those who are actually embracing positive changes in their agenda. So I think that reputational issue is very, very interesting. The other thing that I think is relevant here is the generation that we call the Gen Z. This young generation are much more focused on environmental issues, social issues, etc., much more than any other generation before them. So, for example, I know there was a survey by somebody called Sustainably Lifestyle Frontier Group, and they reported that 93% of global customers want to see businesses that they buy goods or consumer services from support worthy social and environmental issues. So I think that's an important factor. And then there's also, given the young generation I talked about, there's also, I think, a number of studies which talk about how a younger workforce, and I know all of us in this seminar will have experience of this, do think about these social causes, and apparently it does lift their productivity, and I think it's important for talent retention. And going back to your initial question about financial institutions, etc., I think borrowers from financial institutions certainly need to think about it, because DFIs like the IFC and others who are operating in our midst, Proparco, DG, etc., they all have ESG issues very much as part of their lending criteria, loan approval criteria, and also lending conditions. And the same goes for PE funds. PE funds who invest in equity in businesses in our region, because their investors often include the DFIs, they are themselves also making this an important aspect of their approval process and of their conditions of investing. So I really do think that even though there are many, and I can talk about Republicans in America later perhaps, but there are many people in the world who think that ESG is a bit of a scam, it's overrated, etc. But I think personally, given where we're at in Africa, the story is very much nascent, and it's on the rise for all businesses to think about.
Frank, may I add something?
Yeah, yes, please. Proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was just sitting here and I was thinking that perhaps it's really important for us to start off by, defining these three pillars. For anybody who's sitting there and wondering what is all this story about ESG. Now, ESG is basically, the concept of sustainability that brings three different pillars together. And if we start off with the environmental pillar, that's a pillar that just measures any entity's impact on living and non-living, natural systems, your operations impact on the air, on the land, on water, on the complete ecosystems. And it really is about how best are you using the management practices that you have in order to avoid the environmental risks that Sonal has talked about, and also to harness the opportunities, the environmental opportunities, so that you generate longer term shareholder or stakeholder value. So that's the environmental pillar. Now, the social pillar really just measures an entity's capacity to generate trust and loyalty among, say, its workforce, its customers, its society, through, the practices that it adopts. And it's really a reflection of its reputation on the health of the people around it, its license to operate, and how also it is given a license to operate by its stakeholders. And then lastly, the governance pillar measures the company's systems and processes which ensure that board members or other people who have been put in the governance of that institution act in the best interest for its longer term stakeholders. But I also want to say this, Frank, that the ESG concept, when you think about it, is not really new in Africa. It's just that bringing together these three pillars seems as though it is a new concept. Let me explain why. If you go back to how organizations have been operating previously, you used to hear of, oh, we need a CSR, program around a particular area. That concept of CSR morphed into CSI. We need to invest into the community in which we find ourselves in. When you think about it, those two were addressing both the social pillar as well as the environmental pillar. So at a certain time in our history, that was very important. Then we had failures within the corporate world, and you can go back into Kenya, East Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, you'll find all those corporate failures. And then people suddenly realized, oops, we need to focus on the governance pillar. We need boards to know what they are supposed to be doing and to act in the best interest for the longer term sustainability of organizations. That passed because suddenly we realized, oops, Cape Town has no water, the rivers are drying up, we need to focus on the environmental pillar. So in the recent past, we've really focused on the environmental pillar because we are realizing that the resources are getting depleted at a faster rate than we anticipated. But think about it, in the African society, we didn't have running water. We saved water because we just drew little water to use as we wanted, But, moving on to where we are now, ESG is a concept which investors are demanding us to have. Investors are literally, forcing organizations and companies to ensure that we have ESG principles. And they're not wrong to do that because the population is becoming bigger. The resources are not increasing at the same, rate of growth. And it is therefore incumbent upon us to make sure that we are using the resources effectively in a sustainable manner for the future organizations. If you think about the UN principles for responsible investment, for example, which currently has, I guess, about 3,000 signatories, the 5 principles under there are really about, we are not going to do business. It's not going to be business as usual. And we're not going to do business with anybody who does not demonstrate that they are responsible. They are building sustainable organizations and building sustainable societies. But also, when you think about the AU, the African Union, and you look at Africa Union Agenda 2063, it's actually about sustainable development because we are talking about having an Africa that is more prosperous in 50 years. So all of that brings to the fore the importance of ESG and why each and every one of us really must get concerned about what we need to do in each of the three pillars if we are to build sustainable organizations? Thank you, Frank.
Thank you so much. Well, I think that was a very good, should I say, broad understanding of ESG for the last 10 minutes. I just wanted to bring us back to the basics and the principles. So when you look at organizations adopting ESG practices into their become sustainable businesses, I presume that comes with disruption of the legal and regulatory environment they operate in. So I just wanted to know from Beatrice, are there some compliance issues, or should I say compliance practices that organizations should be aware of just to ensure that they comply with relevant standards and requirements, if any? And I'll go with you first, then I'll open it to the other members to also chip in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Yes, I think it's important, and there are different types of organizations, and we'll probably come back to that. But generally speaking, it's important that organizations also familiarize themselves with certain things. One of them is the reporting requirements. I think Lillian has touched on it, what the NSC is doing, and there are other reporting requirements that may be applicable. I know in Kenya, the central bank gave some guidance notes to the banks and the like. So it's important that they understand, what these requirements are. And these don't just apply to, say, the listed companies, as Lillian clarified. It's really a benchmark, because ESG is about setting a higher standard than even what the law requires. And where you see standards being set for certain sectors, you want to really look at what those requirements are and see if you can benchmark against and adopt some of the good practices. There's a lot to look at of companies to know about environmental regulations, because the E is very important. And a lot of for purposes of this webinar, the East African countries are actually introducing much stricter environmental regulations. So you're going to see policies that are looking at addressing issues such as air, water pollution, waste management, deforestation. So you'll see a lot of legislation around that. And really corporates or organizations need to be familiar with those. And then labor and human rights, the S in the ESG is becoming very important. I think if you look at there've been a number of cases, even within East Africa. I think a number of years ago, I don't want to name the company, but there was an agricultural company, that was being cited for human rights abuses against the employees. And what really was the impact of that? So much as this was a Kenyan subsidiary, the supermarkets in the UK, who are its main market, would not stock, their produce. So you'd find the Tesco, Walmart actually stopped stocking their produce. And it's gone as far as directors being held personally responsible in certain instances. Because I think one of the realizations that's quickly coming to be is that unless ESG is owned at the highest level of every organization, it'll never trickle down. So you're finding countries where directors are personally responsible for whatever breaches are committed, even by subsidiaries, in faraway countries. And I think issues such as anti-corruption laws, those are all issues that organizations should be aware about. And just it's good enough. It may not be good enough to say what they should be aware of. I think it's more or less we have to break it down into how to ensure that they, meet some of the requirements. So I've talked of one. I think ESG must sit within the board. For the smaller entities, it must be owned by the founder. And that's the only way you can drive, say, culture change within the organization. I think companies need to make it a habit to conduct ESG assessments, because this helps them to also identify the areas of risk. So it's not just about, what they need to put in. It's actually something that makes them future-proof, because they can identify where the shortcomings are and, mitigate some of those things. And they have to come up with policies and procedures, and these policies and procedures must be aligned with what the law is, what the standards are, reporting standards, so they must be familiar with all that and come up with compliant, strategies, and then a transparent and credible reporting system. And one of the biggest issues, and probably why I think the NSC gave some guidance, is that ESG was reported, and really from its origin, it came from CSR. So you would report it as a CSR activity in any manner that, and so you can imagine with the number of organizations there was no way of actually being able to compare or to quantify or to understand. And this led even to a lot of issues around greenwashing. People, I think organizations claiming that they're doing more than they really are. So what's very important is that they have to come up with, a reporting framework that is uniform, standard, and one that shows, can be quantified, assessed. And I think that's really critical for them. It's important to engage with stakeholders, and the stakeholders vary because it could be the investors, it could be the communities that, they give what we call the social license, it could be the consumers, it could be the regulators, so that you understand what the expectations are around ESG. And I think most important, and this sometimes is overlooked, there has to be investment in ESG experts. And so, because again, ESG is coming up in every sector, there's sometimes a temptation that anyone who has interacted with ESG will be deemed to be the expert and will run with ESG activities, where necessary experts should be sought. And there's experts in very, very many areas of ESG, because ESG is very, cross-cutting. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you so much. That brings me to just my next question, maybe to Lillian. With that said, I would just want to know if the in-house council have a role to play in organizations embracing ESG practices. What role do they have, if any? And are there some of the skills, maybe and expertise that the organization should support the in-house council to develop and accumulate in terms of maybe trainings? I just wanted you to talk a little about that, and maybe also Beatrice can also, and Sonal can also chip in if need be. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And absolutely, yes. In-house council have a role to play in driving this organizational ESG practices. And of course, being lawyers, our bias will be more towards the G, the governance aspect of things. But over and above the governance, or maybe let me just speak very briefly on this governance aspect, but I'm really, preaching to the choir. We are all lawyers, and it helps that there are laws and regulations in place. So, for listed companies, we have the Code of Corporate Governance for issue of securities to the public in Kenya, or whatever equivalent there is in Tanzania and Uganda and Rwanda as well. And thankfully, we have an expert who, very ably was able to, assist in the development of that, like she said, Catherine. So it helps on the governance aspect of things. It helps that there is already a framework in place. So what we can do as in-house counsel is just to make sure that our organizations are complying with whatever regulations that are set and that are in place in whatever sector that our companies are operating in. And Frank, it's interesting because the NSC here in Kenya, or rather, just the practice, the ESG practices, I've seen it in Kenya for the past year and a half since companies just started doing ESG reporting, like coming up with a substantive ESG report. We have noted that even the reports themselves are way skewed on the governance aspect of things. They are able to report or make more disclosures on the governance aspect of things. and they're trying a little on the social, a little more on the environment. So it's work in progress. And so as lawyers, like I said, we already have a framework on the G. So I guess for the E and the S, the environment and the social aspects of things, we have also a role to play. And how we can help our companies or the organizations that we work for as in-house counsel to just, embed ESG practices or my take will be, is to come up with a matrix of sorts, almost like a compliance matrix, depending on what sector that organizations are. Are you in the transport sector, in the telecommunication sector, in the agricultural sector, manufacturing, construction, pharmaceuticals, and financial services? We can all come up with a matrix because there are cross-cutting issues across all those sectors. We have labor issues, we have environmental issues, things on discrimination and all those kind of things. So if we do come up with a matrix of the laws in which our organizations are operating in, we will be able to ask ourselves as in-house counsel, has the NSA, for instance, because we are also an issue of security to the public, for instance, have we as an organization, how are we doing on matters labor? Are we meeting the 2/3 gender rule, like is recommended by our constitution here in Kenya? How are we doing on in matters environment, and not just for transport companies, not just KQ who, for instance, be concerned about carbon emissions, that kind of thing. So Frank, I think if we come up with a matrix of the laws that organizations operate in, we will be able to see or assess whether our organizations are complying. And you will find that all these ESG aspects will fall in place in that sort of a matrix. Number two, how as in-house counsel we can help is be proactive in the sense that, the law changes, regulations come up. We need to be ahead of the curve so that we just don't sit like, waiting ducks, and then, a regulation comes up and, catches everyone unawares. You need to be able to advise your respective organizations in good time that this and this, sort of law has been proposed. This is a sort of impact it has on the organization and how maybe we need to, be prepared for that. For instance, here in Kenya, there is a climate change amendment bill that has been put out for public participation. So these are the sort of things you should be able to pick as an in-house counsel. Go through that law, and that is one of our major roles as in-house counsel, is to analyze regulations that are coming up and see how they impact our different business operations. So we should be able to say, for instance, pick that bill, see how it impacts your organization, if at all. And then so you can keep your organizations ahead of the curve, Frank. So over to you, back to you, brother.
Thank you. And maybe just Sonal, just to pick your brain too, I want you to touch particularly on the element of capacity building for the in-house counsel so they can become better at driving the ESG practices in the organizations. And with the bias, of course, for banking, finance and banking, which I think that's also my space, and this is which contributes a lot to building sustainable businesses. Are there some skills, or should I say special expertise that you would recommend for in-house counsel so they can become better ESG practitioners? Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Maybe before I touch on that, I can just pick up on some of the points that Lillian made. I absolutely agree with her that it's essential for in-house counsel and indeed all lawyers to really understand the legal and regulatory framework, to contribute to draft legislation, etc. But I think, and I know it varies from company to company, business to business, in-house lawyers play a myriad of roles, depending on how large the team is, etc. And I think in-house counsel that I come across in other parts of the world, they're not just dealing with the legal issues, but they're also dealing with risks and providing the board and various committees that might be involved in this area, providing them with necessary guidance. And so it's quite curious. I think an in-house lawyer can play many roles, and you might ask yourself, well, am I leading this? Am I simply there to point out issues for the board, i.e., am I a protector, or am I just an intermediary, responding to things when I'm asked, or am I educating the relevant people within my organization on these issues? And to be honest, I think an in-house lawyer who is effective on ESG issues would be playing all those roles, because I don't think there's just one facet here that is relevant. The other thing that is important, I think, for an in-house lawyer to do is also track what the company's peers and competitors are doing or facing. So whether it's criticism because they're mentioned in some report or newspaper, or whether they're being applauded because they've done something really excellent, and I think those are useful things that in-house lawyers can be doing. And we mustn't forget that the ESG issue is not just for the legal team, right? It impacts so many teams in an organization, whether it's the marketing or business development team, whether it's compliance, whether it's HR. I think an in-house lawyer would do very well in ensuring that they explain consequences to all those team members and they collaborate. One other area that I think it's important that we cover, and maybe I'll pick it up now because it's in my head, is, we talked about the reputational issues previously, and I think there have been instances where companies, because ESG is fashionable, it's trendy, it's a nice to have, some companies have actually been accused of misrepresenting their ESG credentials. And there's actually a word for that. It's called greenwashing. And I think all the in-house lawyers on this call should know that is a problem. And it has caught people out. I think, one of the biggest scandals, or the first big scandal reported on greenwashing, was Dieselgate. Remember in, I think it was 2015, when VW, the car maker, said that their cars were very good in terms of emissions. And it turned out that was just not correct. And so they were fined, millions of dollars. More recently, we were all glued to our TVs last year with the Qatar World Cup. Qatar World Cup and FIFA are in court today because, if you remember, they were advertising that it was the first World Cup ever to be carbon neutral. And various marketing agencies and activists have actually taken issue with FIFA and the World Cup over those claims. So I think it's really important that in-house counsel also make sure that references to the company's ESG credentials are not exaggerated, and they can be verified and defended if there was ever an attack. Just answering your question specifically on what competencies in-house lawyers should have. I think the ability to critically think about the position of the organization in the context of ESG. It's, an effective in-house counsel is not just going to accept what they're being told by business in relation to, ticking certain ESG boxes, for example. They should really be critically questioning if those statements can be supported. I think the ability to collaborate, having good relationships with all team members within an organization, because for the reasons I mentioned, you can't have the marketing or business development team of your organization saying one thing when actually the reality on the ground is something different. So the ability to talk to all the relevant stakeholders within an organization and get their trust and experience and their thinking, I think is important. Knowing the law, Lillian mentioned that, and obviously that's very important. But I think the ability to actually apply the context of a particular regulation or a proposed regulation in the context of the business and its future expansion is also necessary. And I guess, linked to all of this, what makes a really good lawyer, whether in-house or in private practice, particularly in our part of the world, is the ability to think commercially. We can't all be talking about how important it is to be carbon neutral, for example, in our organization, if the company is facing financial difficulties or its money is tied up doing some other project or whatever. We also, all of us, in-house or private, need to be commercial in our thinking. I hope that's answered your question, Frank.
Yes, thank you so much. And Catherine, I just wanted to know from you, we now see the broad picture of ESG related practice, especially in East Africa. What should, for a company that wants to stay ahead of the curve, what are some of the emerging innovations and trends that a company should focus on in terms of ESG? Okay. And while at it, maybe I can also ask you about maybe like some key metrics that maybe would help institutions and develop those initiatives and strategies to implement those new trends. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe, thank you very much, Frank. Maybe before I go on to that question, allow me to just say a few things about the role of in-house counsel. And I think it always starts with the board. I talk a lot to boards, and so I like to give them their rightful place as well. If we want to drive compliance with regard to ESG, then we must steep it in policy. And policy, as you know, is the preserve of the board. And so in-house counsel should be, delivering or advising the board to ensure that the organization has an ESG policy, that the organization has, in addition to the policy, developed, certain targets around each of the 3 pillars of ESG, and that those targets should actually have teeth. So let's not just, Sonal talked about greenwashing. Let's not just say things that we are not even committed to doing as an organization. We should be able to transparently say to our stakeholders, you know what, we committed to do 1, 2, 3, 4 by the end of the year, in 2 years, in 3 years. this is what we have achieved, and this is what we have not done, and the reasons are this, and this is how we are going to move forward. So policy, and then, you know, specific targets around to anchor the policy. But in addition to that, in-house counsel can play a very key role in driving risk assessments and audits around ESG. And I think because of our understanding of the law and understanding of the issues around each of the three pillars, and each of the three pillars has a myriad of laws, it's important that any risk assessments are conducted with the assistance of, or even driven by, you know, in-house counsel. And so that then we can develop strategies going forward in terms of what the organization needs to do. In terms of innovations, I always think that innovations are steeped in the small little things that we don't even think about. And when you look at organizations that have done a lot in the area of ESG, they've basically gone back to the drawing board and focused on the small little things. If you walk into an organization, do you see policies around the use of water? When you go into the washroom, do you see turn on the tap only when you need to use it? Do you see things such as, you know, organizations that have adopted, you know, lights that come on and off with movement, so that you're saving, you know, that energy? Do you see policies around diversity? Because that's also part of ESG, you know. So there's a lot of focus actually on diversity. Diversity, not just in the boardroom, but diversity at organizational level as well. You know, how are we embracing the different, differently abled people, different, you know, people who are, you know, from different regions from us, you know, people who are, you know, totally different from us? How are we embracing diversity and using that diversity to drive the sustainability of the organization? You know, so that is one, going back into the little things that we have always known, but perhaps we haven't focused on them previously. Now, when you think about metrics to measure ESG programs, there are lots and lots of metrics that an organization can be used. But that metrics has to be relevant to what you have set out as a goal. So I would say, for example, if you put some metrics around how many hours in a year all the executives in the organization are going to fly, because when you fly, you're using, you know, there are emissions there. So if you put some metrics around how many hours are we going to fly this year, but you then measure those metrics at the end of the year, that's one way of measuring emissions as well. If you put metrics around forest cover, you know, and how you measure forest cover. So in other words, what I'm saying is it's very difficult to talk about metrics without going into what exactly are we committing ourselves to do. Because then you can have a simple dashboard that tells you whether you're walking in the right direction or whether indeed you're regressing. So you will need to first start with, what are we committing ourselves to do? And it always helps to start by saying or understanding, having a clear understanding across the organization as to why you're doing what you're doing what you're committing to do. You know, so have a very clear understanding. Why are we doing this? What does it deliver? And then once you have understood those two, then you can develop metrics that will help you measure what it is you have committed yourselves to do. It varies from, activities to activities. It varies from industry to industry, and it has to make sense with regard to what you're committing to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I conclude with Beatrice, I just wanted to prepare the audience that I'll be opening the sessions to them. We want to make it as engaging as possible so that we can also hear from you and just in the next 2 to 3 minutes. So Beatrice, I just wanted to know, I see you have a strong background in energy sector. I just wanted to know, in that sector and maybe any other that you work closely with, how have they adopted the ESG practice and what are some of the metrics that they're tracking, just to give more emphasis and understanding on that?
Okay, thank you, Frank.
Yes.
I completely agree with what Catherine has said. Even for people who are involved in the infrastructure space, I think the idea is to first start with the goal, and that guides everything that you do in terms of the metrics. But in terms of some of what we see, and I think that may really be helpful. I think, for example, social indicators, we usually see metrics around, workforce diversity, employee turnover. Are you able to attract, retain employees? Health and safety, how you're engaging with the community. Those are the kind of things we see. Coming to governance, again, we tend to see metrics around board diversity. And this has actually been one of the things that a lot of progress has been made in. And there are still arguments around what board diversity means, because I think there's a general sense when studies are done across boards that the boards are becoming more diverse, but the top positions, the chairmanship, the committee leaderships and the like, maybe not. But those are some of the metrics we see. Executive compensation, what are the board members seeing or earning? I see Catherine is smiling. Shareholder rights, anti-corruption measures, these are the kind of things we see around governance. For financial, we'll usually see things around, revenue growth, profit margins, return on investments. So those I think we're more familiar with. But the trends we're seeing, more and more projects and financing becoming accessible to projects that contain elements of ESG, good ESG practice. So you do find that there's actually lenders or investors who have a pool of funds and actually struggling to get projects that can qualify to access those funds. So that's one of the things we see. Third-party risk management. So it's not enough to look at your own corporate governance, your own ESG compliance, or you have to look also at your whole supply chain. So we see this a lot because the project companies we're involved with are trying to understand who their suppliers are and what measures have they taken to ensure that they're also looking at the E, the S, and the G within their own organizations. And probably also as lawyers, this is something we get. I know for sure that as a law firm, practicing in a law firm, some of our clients actually do an annual review of their suppliers, and we have to then try and report on how we are working to address some of the requirements under ESG. And I think there's a lot of interest also in technology, because I think it just comes with the space. We're talking more about reporting, being transparent, being clear, not greenwashing. So there's a lot of data collection, so we're seeing technology. There's actually ESG technology. I witnessed a demonstration just two days ago that can help with collecting data, reporting, analysis. I don't know if I've talked about circular economy, but these are also very important, because now I think it's not enough, for example, to say I'll put up a plant to manufacture single-use plastics. We're still using single-use plastics, but you see, you really have to have a plan around, once you manufacture and sell those, what is the plan around maybe recycling? Do you have collection points? Do you want to provide for people to leave a deposit and get it back when they return it? So those kind of things are now becoming much more, they're taking front line as we see it.
Thank you so much. So we will be jumping into the engagement with our audience. We have questions coming through, but we also have the audience raising their hands. So I will start by reading a question, then I'll also open the floor for those who want to unmute and ask questions, especially in the audience. So the first question comes from Mr. Ibrahim Kito. He says that ESG comes at a cost, and obviously that's on a host of opportunities. What balance or trade-offs need to be put in place for optimal corporate success? Of course, considering that shareholders are majorly looking at profit, and basically they're looking at profit. So how do you strike a balance in, of course, investing in ESG, embedding it in your operation, as well as, of course, looking at profit? So I'll just give this to Lillian, and maybe Sonal can also chip in. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks, Ibrahim, for your question. Ibrahim, I sort of tend to differ in the sense that ESG comes at a cost. Because in any event, if we do, embed ESG practices, it actually becomes operations. Operations become more efficient, if you ask me. And so maybe the cost aspect could just be a production of a sustainability report, perhaps. But I do tend to think, as opposed to that sort of a thinking, I actually think embedding ESG practices actually improves and increases operational efficiencies, and thus, is a cost-cutting measure in the long run. Frank.
Okay. Sonal, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think Ibrahim's question is a very relevant one, and it is one that I think is the most frequently considered question when ESG is being considered by any organization that is not doing anything in this area. And there are arguments both sides. So even though some people in an organization on the board may think that the benefits will outweigh the cost, there will be others who might say the complete opposite, or might say that we don't have the bandwidth to do that now because it's too time intensive or resource intensive or money intensive, and we don't have those kinds of resources. So I think the starting point has to be, does the organization want to do something about it? And if so, they've got to assess what they want to focus on. And it may be that there are a whole bunch of things that could be considered, but if it approaches it on a area by area basis, which is then, it's provided with a budget, it's provided with a timeline, it's provided with the necessary manpower to implement it, then I think there's a way forward. But without buy-in, it won't happen. So you get the buy-in, get the budget, get the necessary resources, and be able to track it, because there's no point this being just a piece of paper that's sitting in the minutes of a meeting, and then someone takes the dust off a year later to see what was that we talked about last year? You know, there has to be proper engagement around it. And I think this is where in-house counsel can be very, very important.
Frank, maybe just to add.
Yes, please.
Maybe just to add that ESG equals sustainability. So in the long run, it is actually cheaper. Think about it. Today, you want to install solar panels on your house. It's going to be very expensive. But in the long run, it's going to be cheaper for you because that source of energy you were using before is getting depleted. And therefore, in the long run, it's going to be more expensive. But if you installed the solar panels, they are sustainable. They're using the natural light. So in the long run, it's going to be cheaper for you. So just think sustainability and also think about your impact on living and non-living things. So you might not feel the impact yourself, but your operations are having an impact on somebody else, you know, because you're discharging effluent into the river, somebody downstream has to spend a lot of money treating that water before they can use it. So ultimately, all of those practices that are not aligned to the ESG pillars tend to be more expensive than ESG. And like I said before, let's not think about ESG as these grand, big things that we need to do. It's the everyday things that we see in our houses, you know, the things that we can control. Should I throw rubbish, you know, degradable rubbish like waste vegetables, you know, the stalks in the dustbin, or should I throw them into the shamba because they will help, you know, generate crops? All of those are sustainable practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe from the audience, there's a question about how the private practice, legal practitioners approach ESG. So I just wanted to ask this maybe to Beatrice and also now, any one of you can take it. The audience member is asking, other than advising clients on how to approach ESG, what are your law firms or organizations doing to integrate ESG into your, of course, institutions? And basically he's asking, do you practice what you preach? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question, and it's it's good that it's coming up. So I think I can speak about our firm, and what I'll say is that I think we do practice what we preach. And Catherine has said it's the small things. You don't have to think of very out of this world things. We don't, for example, use single-use plastics. We don't buy bottled water. We used to buy that before, but we don't anymore. So all our drinking water is bottled in glass bottles. The use of paper within office environment is now something that we're more or less almost paperless. So, and that's very tough for a law firm because lawyers are used to bundles and bundles of files. I think you've seen some of these court cases. There was one famous one many years ago, the Golden Bird case, where they had to hire a lorry to carry the pleadings to the court. So I think that was a long time ago. So that's not being done anymore. What I said about suppliers, we also apply that because you know, even our clients require us to meet certain ESG requirements, and we demand that of our suppliers as well. We've looked at things like travel for conferences and the like, which we still do because it's still necessary to do that. But a lot of meetings and conferences now are being held also virtually, and you know, we're very supportive of that. I'll have to say that one of our related firms has its own corporate solar PPA, so they have their own PPA, that's really power purchase agreement. On their rooftop, they've put up a whole solar plant, and that's the power that they're using. We also have are integrating a rooftop solar solution for our office premises. And these are just some of the things that we are doing. There are many others. But what I want to say is that ESG, it applies to everybody, the law firms as well, but even us as individuals. And I do know that even on a personal basis, there are a lot of things that people are doing. There are a lot more people cycling to work now, even to the office. And those are some of the steps that we are seeing.
So now, would you like to share some of your experiences? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Frank. Very good question. So as a law firm, I think we tick a number of boxes. In one of the last questions, Beatrice mentioned how even law firms as suppliers of services to companies are often required to explain their diversity and gender balance, etc., in order to win work from a client. And we had this ourselves a couple of years ago with a company in the West who wanted us, and I kid you not, I think their pitch proposal that we had to fill in had a whole bunch of questions. I mean, this pitch proposal ran to about 100 pages on all sorts of questions about our employees, our ethnicity, our diversity, this, that, and the other. And at the end of it, they said, you scored better than we did. So I'd like to think that we are practicing what we preach. We're more than 50%, we're about 60% female lawyers versus male lawyers. Even our partnership is 50-50. We are from all diverse backgrounds, not only within Kenya, but also globally. We take the issue of ethics very seriously and have various codes that employees must be trained in and must practice. We have, we talked about employee productivity earlier, and their mental health is also part of the S in ESG, and I think it was particularly relevant during COVID. We introduced an app for our employees to actually talk confidentially to a third party about any mental health issues that they might be going through, and we were even paying for, without knowing who it might be, for their counseling or whatever therapy might have been necessary. Rule of law, I think, is very much part of this agenda as well, and that's something that we, through our ALN Academy, do a lot of in terms of ensuring ministries, public officials, and others understand the importance of rule of law, and we take up a lot of pro bono cases that speak to that. I mentioned CSR and our work on single-use plastic earlier, legislative framework around that. So yes, I hope that gives you an idea of the kind of things that we do.
Yes, thank you. We really appreciate. I'll just take this opportunity to appreciate the audience. We are really receiving a lot of insightful questions and also, of course, comments. We may not be able to, of course, answer all of them, but we'll try. And of course, appreciation to the panel for taking them up. Talking of diversity and, of course, other requirements in terms of embedding ESG practices into organizational activities, I just wanted to ask Catherine. Well, it's not me asking, but I'm reading out the question. So it goes like this. The audience member is saying that for the social arm of the ESG pillars, how can an organization strike a balance, especially when you look at two competing aspects, that's of gender and of course disability. He's asking, wouldn't there be a crash in outcomes while ranking these factors? That is for gender and disability aspect. He gives a case study of how can you convince a qualified woman that you do not consider her for employment or promotion when you promoted a different able-bodied person, for example? What is the place of merit in the ESG discussion?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Oh my goodness, quite a difficult question, but let me attempt to respond to it. First and foremost, ESG does not envisage that we are going to sacrifice merit for some of these parameters. Where we have reached as a society is that we believe that we have people who are qualified, but quite diverse. It is what efforts are you putting in as an organization to get to reach those people who you believe are fully qualified. So let me give an example. I advertise a job in my farm, and I advertise in a manner in which I know perhaps the people in deep interior Kenya or Uganda or wherever will not be able to see it. I am actually cutting out a whole population that is fully qualified. Now, let me come to gender and disability. It's not one or the other. It is not that if you have to have diversity, if you have to have gender, you're going to sacrifice diversity. And this is what I usually say to boards. As board members, you need to be composed in a manner that speaks first to your strategy and secondly to your stakeholders. So you have to ask yourselves the question, who are our stakeholders and what is our strategy, and therefore who do we need around this table? You then plot the type of diversity that you need around the table for you to meet your strategy, for you to meet the needs of your stakeholders. It is the same for employees as well. That at the time you're advertising a job, you have looked within the organization and you have said, from a composite perspective, there are certain people who are missing, or rather there are certain stakeholders' needs we have not addressed because of who we have in this place. And therefore, we do need to ensure that we have reached out to those stakeholders. Therefore, right from the point at which you advertise the role, you know that you're looking out for certain elements of diversity, whether it's disability or whether it is gender. And you're not going to, start telling Catherine, we did not tell you, we did not pick you, although you are the most qualified, because we needed to pick so and so. You are going to shortlist in a manner that recognizes the diversity elements that you're looking for. And therefore, whoever you're going to pick as an employee is going to, you're not going to change the metrics at the end of the day. You set the metrics before you actually shortlist for the role. That way, you're actually not sacrificing diversity for disability or vice versa, or any other type of diversity that you're looking for. So as a society, we've got to realize that diversity is important. And this whole issue of this person is not as qualified as the other, I find that sometimes it is an excuse. Because if we put in certain efforts to get these people, they are there. They are brilliant people who perhaps are abled differently or come from remote areas, but we haven't put in the effort to find them. And so part of the metrics you'd be using to assess your ESG would be what efforts have you put in to attract these people. I hope I've tried, but one of the other panelists can help. Yeah.
Maybe just before I open the audience, the Q&A session of the audience, I would like to take the last two questions that have been sent through. And just for emphasis, we are almost at the final stretch of this webinar. So we may not be able to answer most of the questions because we really appreciate the audience sending them through. But I'll just pick two and I'll shoot them at Sonal and Lillian. The first one, as you prepare to answer them, and maybe in the interest of time, we'll just try to keep them short. And the first one from Belmont, as he asks, or he or she asks that, how can you as an advocate try to convince a client or a company to invest in ESG and basically demonstrate the importance of a company embedding ESG practices into its operations? And two, is also asking, how do lawyers choose which initiatives to apply, especially considering that the scope of ESG is quite wide? Is there any standard or harmonized approach on how you prioritize the different ESG initiatives to implement? Those are two questions in one, but I would like to leave them open to you, Lillian, as well as Sonal. And these questions are from Belmont as well, and Judy, who are in the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, very, very interesting questions. And interestingly, the first of those questions is linked to the question before about the place of merit in promotions. Convincing, I think the questioner asked, how do you convince a company to invest in ESG? At the end of the day, I think it would be really, really difficult to persuade a CEO or the MD or the board of a company to think about ESG over and above the commercial benefits of the business to the organization, its shareholders, stakeholders, etc. At the end of the day, if you're a business and you are there because your shareholders want you to make money, which most shareholders and investors would want, it would be very hard to say, well, actually, we didn't make any money this year because last year because we invested our money in a program that helps I don't know, a carbon offset, for instance, because we have to be commercially realistic. And this goes back to one of the points I'd made earlier about an in-house counsel's role in this process. There's no point talking to a CEO or an MD to try and persuade them to adopt an ESG narrative if it's not obviously going to make money, either in the short term, medium term, or long term, and that fits into the strategy of the business. So being commercially aware of the business's needs is I think critical. And obviously as a lawyer, you need to understand not only why something that you're proposing will be helpful to the organization, you would also want to do your homework and make sure that you also have at your fingertips, in case you are asked, what are the benefits and what will it mean in terms of the business's profitability either in the medium to long term. You can't have one discussion alone without thinking about the others. So I, you know, and I'm an employment lawyer as well as a banking and finance lawyer, so I can tell you that if you said to someone, well, employ this person because it will help tip our diversity ratios positively, but the person doesn't actually have the credentials that somebody else who doesn't tick that box. As a business owner, I know who I would pick, you know, because as a business, you want to make sure that you're not going to fall flat on your face for your business needs now. You can have a program that may run over time, but I think it would be a very hard sell to try and, you know, to use the questioner's words, convince someone to adopt something that actually doesn't fit with the business needs of the organization.
Thank you. So, Lillian?
Thank you, Frank. I think Sana has quite very well articulated that question. So allow me to just very quickly touch on Judy's question on what framework do we use? I agree with you, Judy, and the rest of the participants. There are a myriad of guidelines, of frameworks that are, you know, out there. But this is why we are here as the NSE. At least in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda is yet to develop ESG guidelines. So you're welcome to borrow from us or to learn from us, Frank. But in Kenya, Judy, if you're in Kenya, this is why the NSE developed the disclosures and guidance manual. And this was to particularly address your very question, to help reduce the uncertainties on what standards to apply. And, you know, for us, we did go with the GRI standards, the Global Reporting Institute standards. And why did we go for this? Because we relied on a global survey on sustainability reporting that had been done by KPMG, that, you know, found out that the GRI standards were the most widely used framework for sustainability reporting. So we highly recommend these guidelines because, you know, they aim at improving and standardizing ESG information that is reported by all companies, you know, across the country and even beyond. These guidelines, I must say that they provide a very, very granular, you know, a tactical approach to ESG reporting. And, you know, obviously we have said that, you know, we are using GRI standards, so they meet the international standards of GRI reporting. Over and above that, this guidance manual from the NSE will help an organization, you know, capture the significant, excuse me. They will help companies, you know, capture the significant opportunities for stakeholders, you know, while managing business risks well at it. Frank, sorry, I need to grab a cup of water. Or another glass of water. But I hope I've answered your question, Judy.
Yes.
In Kenya, at least go with the GRI standards. But of course, you know, organizations are free to pick whatever framework that suits them, so long as it's, you know, internationally accredited. See what suits your particular organization. But for purposes of the GRI, I mean, for the purposes of the ESG guidance and disclosure manual that was, you know, issued by the NSE, we did go with the GRI standards. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Lillian. As we come to the end of our webinar, we have about 10 minutes. Maybe just I'll open the floor to all panelists just to give us your last the takeaways and the last remarks on this important topic. Thank you. I'll start with you, Catherine, then Beatrice, and the rest follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. This has been a very interesting discussion, and I'm grateful for you know, inviting me. I think my closing remarks around ESG are this. ESG is not about those big grand things. I want to repeat that. It's about the small things that we do each and every day. Secondly, we are not going to move, you know, we're not going to make a lot of progress unless we track our progress, unless we set targets for ourselves, targets with teeth, you know, so what happens if I don't, you know, deliver on my targets? And one of the best ways of ensuring that we have set targets with teeth is having an informal partnership with our stakeholders, i.e. disclosing what our targets are to our stakeholders, who will then hold us accountable for the delivery of those targets. So it behooves each and every one of us, not just in organizations, but even at home, to set some targets around ESG, and then to track them, to follow through, and to hold yourself accountable, even as you require stakeholders to hold you accountable. Let me give another easy example at home. You have visited, I'm in a hotel room right now, and there's this huge shower head. And you actually don't need that huge shower head because it's just draining a lot of water. So can we even limit the amount of water we use when we are bathing? There are people who have no water. Cape Town had no water for quite some time. So what sort of targets can we set at individual level and at the corporate level? And how do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we partner with our stakeholders to hold us accountable? It boils down to me and you to drive this ESG agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In 1 to 2 minutes, Beatrice, then Sonal and Lillian, that order, in the last remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I think on my part, it's been a very informative engagement. And I thank all the participants for taking the time to listen and for the excellent contributions from the panel. I think for me, what my take home or my last words are that ESG is here to stay for businesses that are looking or have a long-term view and want to be here in the future. If you want to build a future-proof business, I think my take home is that really you have to incorporate ESG in everything that you're doing. And it's a trade-off. It may look like, you know, in the short term, there's a lot of effort, investment that's required, but it ultimately pays off and ensures that you retain the business, that you minimize risks, so you don't have to have huge payouts down the line at the expense of, you know, sacrificing short-term profits. I think from the perspective of the lawyers who are on this webinar, I think I've picked up a few issues. I think we have to be commercially minded. So we have to look at it because ESG is so broad. It cuts across every discipline that is in a business. You have to be commercially minded. You have to be able and willing to engage with, you know, with all the stakeholders in the business. It means that you need to wear many hats, but so be it, because that really is the role that we have. As people who understand the law, we're actually best placed to be guiding and protecting our businesses using really that tool, which is the law. Thank you very much. I think maybe Son allows to hand over to you.
Thanks, Beatrice. No, thank you, Frank and EALS for organizing this. It's been really interesting to hear the views of the panelists and also the questions. Just in closing, I think it's clear to everyone that ESG is way more complex than just complying with legal standards. And even though there are some signs of progress towards uniformity and consolidation, there are certainly, even in the West, forget about this part of the world, even in the West, there are no universal standards yet. So it's very much an uneven playing field, and different rules can apply in different places. So even if your businesses are across jurisdictions, it's fragmented and difficult. What's important, though, in terms of this narrative, and particularly for the in-house lawyers who are very interested in moving the needle on this within their organizations, is to try and find where the advantages of some of these ESG issues, of which there are, a whole bunch, but to find the ones where they think that there will be some positive impact to the business. And for example, in my role as a finance lawyer, I know that there's a lot of money out there which is available for projects that are going to make a difference from an environmental perspective, whether it's climate change related or sustainability. There is a lot of money out there. There is also a lot of money out there if you can perform on various indices. So, for example, I've just closed a financing for a telecoms company that received a lot of money, and the pricing of the loan, the interest rate of that loan changes to their favor if they meet certain performance indicators on diversity and a whole bunch of other things. So that kind of opportunity is, I think, really important. Beatrice just mentioned that ESG is here to stay. I think that's right. Catherine said, clients are demanding it. And the first thing that came to my head when she said that is that if you read some of the papers this week in the international press, I wanted to say not in Texas and not in Florida, because in Texas and in Florida, the state governments are actually banning their pension funds from investing in any companies that talk about ESG. So this is this Republican woke agenda that I mentioned. Fortunately, in my view, fortunately for us, I don't think that's happening in our part of the world. So I also agree that it's here to stay. And the last point I wanted to make is, having embarked on an ESG program of any kind, whether it's one thing or two things or whatever it is, if you don't measure it, then it didn't happen, right? So always make sure that not only do you present something that benefits the organization that you're in, but it's also something that you can build on and you can measure, so you can report on it, and then the organization can build on that. That's all I wanted to say in closing, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you. Lastly, Lydia.
Thank you, Frank, and my fellow panelists as well as participants. I think I can only echo what the other speakers have said. ESG really is here to stay. There are regulatory changes that are making ESG reporting a mandatory requirement are really on the rise. Kenya is one. Now we are requiring listed entities to do ESG disclosures, and so you will see this sort of practice across the globe as time goes by. Secondly, why I say ESG is here to stay. It might interest you to know that IFRS trustees have actually set up an intention to develop enterprise value standards so that financial reporting is inclusive of risks and opportunities that are presented in a company's sustainability performance. So you can see, sustainability is also being dragged into financial reporting. So really, just as the other speakers have said, ESG is here to stay. But from a regulatory, point of view, from where we sit at the NSE, we are glad that, more and more companies are adopting, sustainability reporting. They are, disclosing what they are doing to embed ESG practices in their different, organizations. And so from where we sit, we can only, encourage you to continue doing that in your small with little way as, in-house counsel, as lawyers. And like Catherine said, if I can just, cap it up, ESG equals sustainability. I mean, I couldn't say it better. ESG is equals to sustainability. So the more we embed these practices, the more sustainable our business and operations become. And thank you very much to the East African Law Society for just giving me the chance to participate in this very informative webinar as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists, and I guess I also have my last word. Just a vote of thanks to all of you for your time, for the insights and knowledge shared. I think myself and the audience following online will leave with a lot of, information about ESG. And I guess it's a mutual commitment to drive ESG in practices into organizations, wherever we are, even at an individual level. My last word is to thank the Secretariat at the East Africa Law Society for organizing such a great platform, or should I say, an opportunity for members to learn and grow, especially through the webinar, where we, of course, get an opportunity to learn and share knowledge in all topics of particular concern for the members of ELS. So I'd like to thank you once again, the panelists and the audience, for being quite engaging, and we apologize for not, of course, addressing all the questions in the interest of time, but we look forward to having you back for the other planned sessions and webinars, and also we hope you continue the ESG discussions wherever you are. Thank you so much. I thank you once again, and goodbye from us here at the, I was going to say at the webinar studios, but goodbye. And for those who would like to follow up on the discussions, you can subscribe to the East Africa Law Society YouTube page. You'll find this recording uploaded there and others before and come in the future. This is goodbye from the moderator, Frank, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank.
Yes.
Thank you.